How's it going, YouTube? Come on, today with another video, and today, guys, what the bring to you is going to be the Ultimate Striker Guide. Now, I'm very excited to bring you this video. It has taken me a long time to break down literally everything that I want to talk about because there's just so much. There's so many different deck lists in this video. I'll leave them all down in the description below so that you can find them easily. We'll talk about a lot of different ways you can play Striker, what the cards do, the tech options, the history of Striker. We're going to talk about a lot of the different intricacies with the deck, answering a lot of your questions that you asked. Thank you so much for the responses. I really do appreciate it. There's just so much that we're going to be covering in this video. So thank you for being here. We're on our way to 20,000 subscribers. So if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. Once I hit 20,000 subscribers, we're doing the biggest giveaway that I've ever seen. And I'm very excited to be able to do that for you because I love giving back to my community. Whether it's big or small, it's something that I really love doing. So I really can't wait till we hit 20,000 and I have an opportunity to do one of the coolest things that I think I could possibly do. If you haven't already checked out my sponsors over at Imperium Duels, Dragon Shield, Gem, or Sleeve Chief, definitely go ahead and check them all out down in the description below. And then Sleeve Chief did just drop their new My Hero Academia sleeves, so definitely go ahead and go check those out over on the website. And then also, if you haven't already got my playmat over at Imperium Duels, definitely go ahead and pick that up too. Without further ado, let's hop right into the first slide of the Ultimate Striker Guide. So the first thing I want to cover is going to be technical play. Now, technical play is by and large the most important thing to think about when you're playing Striker. That's getting the most value using the least amount of resources. Now, the reason this is important is because Striker is all about the one-for-one trades. That's why I like cards like Chalice, because it's something that you can go ahead and just use. You're not wasting a lot of resources to bait or use other cards to like force interaction. You're just able to go ahead and turn something off very quickly in response to something that you're doing. Technical play is all about, again, just using as little amounts of cards to get the biggest profit. So if you can trade with like one Pankratops for 3 cards, then you're in a really good position. Same thing with cards like Burner. You want to make your opponent play your game, not theirs. And that's by setting the tempo. Now, tempo is really important when you're playing Striker. And I love Striker so much because of the fact that you have a lot of different cards that can help set the tempo. And now this is what was really good about Mystic Mind. Of course, the card was really toxic, but it allowed you to put the pace of the game at your fingertips. So you could basically just activate Mystic Mind and sit on it for a little while. But it was also something where you had to know when to clear your own Mystic Mind and play the game. Because the second your opponent opened up the out, you were probably dead. So this is something where you really have to take a lot of consideration into whatever kind of floodgate, or if you're sitting on some kind of boss monster, or if you're in a simplified game state, when do you really want to speed up the gameplay, or do you want to just coast until you're at a position where you feel like you can go for game? And we'll talk about that more later on as well. But tempo is by and large going to be one of the key factors that will tell you if you're playing the deck really well or playing the deck at a point where maybe you need a little bit of help in understanding how to play the deck better. So the next thing is talking about your starters. So we'll talk about linkage here in a moment, but you have Drone, Ray, and Rose. All of these are very important, of course. If you don't see an ace, you don't play the game. I really do like having the effect of Rose in the graveyard, and what I mean by that is this. So Rose has a very unique effect in the graveyard where if you clear your opponent's monster in the EMZ, you can special summon Rose as Chainlink 1 and then non-targeting negate a monster that your opponent controls. It's very important in the mirror match because you turn off Ray effect. So as you'll see here, you go Burner, target Shizuku, Chainlink 1 since I'm turn player, summon Rose negating Ray. So this is a really awkward position for your opponent because if they have set cards like Striker cards that they want to use, then they have to go Ray effect for no effect because it'll just resolve without effect. And then they can use their back row, which is already really awkward because if they have no ace in hand and they have engage, now they have to use engage on an ace monster. Like, yeah, they can search Widow Anchor, but if you have Widow Anchor yourself, then if they anchor your monster, you just chain your own anchor to target your own Shizuku, and then your monster doesn't get taken because you negate your monster first since the chain links work backwards, and therefore your opponent now loses because they greeted to search Widow Anchor instead of just going for like another ace monster. This is a huge reason why in the mirror match you'll see me start sending Rose and not Ray at all. Like, I wouldn't keep a Ray in my graveyard because I just know if I draw any kind of destruction effect or if I have like an anchor or just anything else that isn't an ace monster, that your opponent gets punished really hard for you just having a Rose and Graves, because it's the best way to counter Ray coming back to the board, right? Because you don't want your opponent to go Ray into Kagari, add back engage. Like, that's just way too much advantage in a deck that really thrives off advantage, right? So usually I'm always just sending Rose to the graveyard because I feel like that's just a really good way to put yourself ahead. And I think that's a really good way to make sure that you are always top decking better, right? Because if you see like a burner off the top of the deck and you have a Rose and Graves, you already know that you're going to be in a very good position moving into the rest of the game. Now, although you have Hornet Drone, Ray, and Rose, you also have Linkage, which is a very cool card that allows you to go ahead and send anything off of your board. But if you do have something in your EMZ, you have to send the monster that's in the EMZ because this card is trying to summon to the EMZ. If you have a Rose and Ray engrave, or just a light and dark striker ace, usually it's Rose and Ray, then you can gain 1,000 attack on top of your monster, which then allows you to go for the OTK. This consists of going normal summon Ray, attack for 15, tag out into Hayate attack for 15, send Rose, linkage into Kagari add back the linkage, attack for 25, linkage into Shizuku, attack for another 25, and that's the full 8,000 damage. All you need is Ray and linkage, so definitely really crazy and not a lot of cards that you need to put up 8,000 damage. This is something that's still very new for Striker because we never had this before linkage, so this is definitely very nice in simplified game states where even if your opponent's at like 55 or 6,000, they are at a bigger risk of being hit with that 6,000 damage very quickly. So I think that's pretty cool, and it's a really nice line to have in Striker. Now, linkage and booster are both very similar in my opinion because they both essentially fulfill the same goal, but Ego Booster does protect other things in the deck. Let's say you put up like a Chaos Angel, you can go ahead and like booster your own Chaos Angel, which is always really cool. But at the same time, booster isn't really that crazy outside of like the mirror match. I still like linkage a lot because it's like kind of booster, because if your opponent like anchors you, you can chain linkage, get rid of your monster, and they don't have to worry about the anchor being there. So a lot of really cool interactions, and also this card is just a starter. It does lock you into striker monsters for the rest of the turn from the extra deck, which is a little unfortunate, but at the same time, it comes up quite a bit, and it's a very good card. But moving forward here, talking about multi-roll, we did just get this card back to 3. I get a ton of questions on, you know, hey, do we run this card at 3? Do we run it at 2? Like, what's the optimal number? I think that if you're going second, you're still just running 1, because running anything more than that is not really helping you at all. I think that it's nice, but at the same time, if you open more than 1, it's not the best thing to see in your hand. If you're going first, though, I think that there is a lot to say that this card does a lot better, just because if you do open up a subpar hand and you really need like that Rota to go off or that Engage to go off, then this does allow you to be able to do that. It also depends on the build that you're running, because if you're running like the Runic build, then you need a way to get rid of your Striker Ace monster and the EMZ so that you can put up another Hugin to search another Fountain if you need to, or like a Gary to get one back. So I think multi-roll has a lot of uses in most scenarios. I'm probably still just running 1 in most of my list. I know in some of the lists that you'll see today I'm running 2, but just know that even now I'm thinking that I'll probably just stick with 1, because I don't really think after testing that you really need more. So something that's really unique about multi-roll and Area Zero, they both work the same way in the interaction with Ray, where you can go multi-roll, target Ray, chain Ray, and then your opponent can't respond to your spells for the rest of the turn. And that's something that a lot of people don't know. It's the same thing that you can go Area Zero, target Ray, chain Ray, but you can do that with multi-roll too. And that has won me countless games, because my opponent tries to respond to my spell afterward, and I'm like, you can't. And they're like, why? I'm like, multi-roll, target Ray. So it's pretty good. It doesn't send for cost, it just sends for effect. And so since you already fulfilled the target and then you go into a new Link monster, you're all good to go for the rest of the turn. So your engages and whatnot will be live. And that's where a lot of people are like, maybe I do run more than 1 multi-roll. I really don't think that you need to, but I think that 1 is fine moving forward. Now, this is my favorite interaction in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I've talked about this several times, but if you haven't already heard about this, I'll just reiterate it. So what you do is you go activate multi-roll, set talent into a board of negates, And so they have to interact with multi-role, and there's going to be cards like this no matter what deck you play. If you're playing Vanquish Soul, they have to interact with Razan. If you're playing Kashtira, you know that they're going to interact with Unicorn. So there's always a card, right? So you go activate multi-role, set talents, you go multi-role, target talents. Now, the reason I think this is my favorite interaction in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Either they let multi-role go through and you never needed talents, or they negate multi-role and then you flip talents, you bait a second negate. So definitely a very cool interaction, just something to play through quite a lot because both of these cards can be pretty scary. But moving forward away from this, talking about Accesscode. Now, I get a ton of questions about Accesscode. How do we summon Accesscode? Is it still needed? Is it really important? Now, Accesscode alone is something that really does come up a lot. Now, I've had several games where you just don't even need to worry about summoning it because you just gain so much advantage off of your striker cards, and then just being able to attack with your link monsters and whatnot, like, usually that's fine. But there's a lot of games where you're going to have a Accesscode situation. Now, this is something where before you summon Accesscode, I'm probably going through each one of my links. I'll summon Hayate, I'll summon Kagari, then I'll summon Shizuku, and then I will, like, steal a 3 and make Accesscode, just so I know that I have several pops lined up in Grave. And I think that's something that you should really think about, is how many cards do you realistically have to pop, and then you cycle through that many of your link monsters. Because if you have linkage, and let's say you're also playing Kaina, I don't play Kaina, you can go like Kaina, Hayate, and Kagari, add something back, go into Accesscode, and then once you're done clearing the board and attacking, you can go linkage into Shizuku and then get an end phase search, and then your multi-roll like sets everything back so that your opponent literally just can't come back at all after that. Then you also have to think about when you're clearing the board, do you leave one card so you don't lose to Evenly or Lightning Storm? And that's something where a lot of people like pop the field spell that's on their board if it's like a Racial or what have you. I'm leaving that on the board almost always, because if I leave up Accesscode, I just don't want to get imprimed either and go back down to 23. Sometimes 53 is just hard to get over. So there's not a world where I'm popping Racial. I would just leave it on the board and then not have to worry about like half the blowouts that could be coming your way. So just a really cool thing to think about. Also, a lot of people ask me, you know, like, how are we making an Accesscode? And so this is something that is really important too. You're usually holding anchors and shark cannons, so you can actually go ahead and summon out like the bigger monsters out of your extra deck, whether it be like a Topologic or an Accesscode. But using Anchor to steal something off their board, using like a Shark Cannon to steal a Link 2 or a Link 3 out of your opponent's graveyard, these are all very important ways to go ahead and Link Climb. But also, we have other cards in our extra deck. Like, I usually play 2 or 3 Charmers in my extra deck at a time, and that's going to be Hida, Lina, or Dark. I cut Lina recently. I'm playing Hida and Dark. I think Hida is really important right now. I just think that there's a lot of fire targets in the graveyard lately, and then everyone's still on Ash Blossom, so it just comes up a lot more than Lina does. I've seen a lot more people cut Valor than anything, so I just want to go back to a Charmer that I know there's going to be a hand trap for in the graveyard. Then you can go any of the Charmers into Celine because they are a spellcaster. Then if there is a Valor in your graveyard or a spellcaster in their graveyard, you can go ahead and reborn one with Celine. So usually the list that I'm playing, the Celine package, I'm also going to be on Valor just to make sure that there is an option for me to go for this play. Now, a lot of you are probably asking, like, why are you playing only 3 targets for a spellcaster if you want to go for, like, a Celine play? It's already a Link 3, so the odds that you can summon a monster or steal one is going to be pretty high. But also, you have to realize that you're not making Accesscode right away. Unless you're, like, stealing something that's, like, huge off their board and then just making an Accesscode real quick and doing 8,000 turn 2, which doesn't happen a ton. It can, but it doesn't happen a ton. But usually you have to use 2 Hayate to put your opponent in lethal range, because poking twice for 15 and putting your opponent at 5,000, you immediately can go Accesscode in the follow-up turn and just kill. So that should be your goal that you're trying to set up, right? And if you're going second, there is a chance that you just steal a bunch of monsters and do a ton of damage, and then they're already in lethal range, right? But at the same time, you do want to make sure that you are poking a couple times with Hayate, usually under like a floodgate, so you know that you'll live. And this gives you the opportunity to at least put your opponent into that lethal range. A lot of people were asking me why I still run Upstart Goblin, and they're like, well, you give them 1,000 life points, now they're going to be out of lethal range more often than not. I'm definitely trying to draw a card and put a spell engrave regardless. Like, it doesn't matter if you give them 1,000 life points. Like, you're still going to be able to lethal your opponent if you're at that position. Like, if you're ever in a point where you're summoning Accesscode, clearing their whole board and attacking for game, I promise you that 1,000 life points probably does not matter. So that's something where you are getting more advantage, you're digging more into your deck, you're hitting spell count faster. I don't really think that there's a time that I'm not running Upstart right now. And you'll see a lot of different variations in the builds, but I'm running like Terraforming, Rhoda, Upstart. I'm doing all the mandatory 1-ofs in the deck. I just really want to hit spell count as soon as possible. That's really important, especially with 2 engage. If you open that early on, you really want to make sure that you are hitting spell count so you can go immediately in card advantage. But another huge thing too that I want to mention real fast is that if you greed your engage, there's a good chance that you might lose because you made the incorrect play. Realize that sometimes using engage, even though you don't get a draw, if it's your 3rd spell engrave to make something like an anchor or a burner live, it's worth it because you can always Kagari it back after you use burner or anchor, and that's perfectly fine. But I've seen a lot of people go, no, like the main focus is we have to draw, and so they'll just throw spells in the graveyard so that they can get a draw. Sometimes engage being the 3rd spell is okay. So just keep that in mind whenever you're going through your decision tree before you make like the huge play. Sometimes you don't need to draw because you will get the draw later on regardless. Worry about breaking the board first and how much value you can get out of your cards. If you can get a ton of value out of engage and you're not wasting spells, go for it. If you're going to be wasting resources just to get a draw, unless you like really need it, don't do it. Talking more so about 2 of the craziest cards in the deck. One being a Hornet Drone. Now, Drone isn't just a monster that you can summon that you can go into an ace with, but it's also a dark monster, which is crazy because it allows you to go into the Dark Charmer. Now, the Dark Charmer has always been one of the craziest cards in the extra deck, won me a ton of games. And also, if you have to pass on Dark Charmer, the second they deal with Dark Charmer, you search Ray. So this card comes up quite often, and I'll show you why. So here's the playline that I picked up from playing Math Mech. If you were playing against the mirror match and you had a Kurakara, and your opponent was drawing off a Heat Soul, you could Kurakara, get rid of the Heat Soul, draw in the end phase, and then in the draw phase, draw again with Heat Soul, which I thought was really cool. And that's something that I definitely wanted to use moving forward if I ever found another situation that I came up with. Now, Vanquish Soul is gaining a lot of popularity, and what if I told you you could do the same thing against that deck? Now, I was playing one night against this deck, and I was in a really awkward position where I really just needed hand traps, and I was like, what do I do? And so I made Dark Charmer, and I'm staring at Engage in my hand, and I'm like, there's not a whole lot that I really can do at the moment with this. I can save it for next turn and get like an anchor, but they have like a lot of cards that, you know, they can tag out with. I need something crazy right now. So what I did was I used Engage, and then I was able to search. I get a draw here too in that match that I was in, but then I used Dark Charmer to target Borger, and then I reveal array, draw a card, effect, reveal array, draw a card. And that was so cool because I drew like the Ash Blossom that I needed, and I was able to just net so much advantage just because I caught this last second. I was like, wow, I can search Ray and I can just draw a ton of cards, because at the moment I knew they couldn't kill me. So these are the things that you really have to think about whenever you're utilizing even your Charmers. And I think that's really cool just because they net you a lot of advantage that you otherwise wouldn't have. And it also allows you to go into your Accesscode and your Topologics and what have you. So I think that's really nice, and I think Dark Charmer is definitely like one of the most mainstays in the extra deck. But it's probably one of the craziest cards that we've got so far in the deck. Now, this is another question that I get a lot. And so, which pot do you play? I typically like Desires. I'm always going second with the deck, but even going first, I still think that Desires is correct because I'm trying to draw an additional card. I'm trying to get into a Floodgate, I'm trying to get into another hand trap, where Prosperity gets you a very specific card, and I feel like if Prosperity gets ashed, it hurts a little bit more than Desires, because even if you have 3 spells in graveyard at that point, you still can't draw with Engage, so it's definitely not my favorite. Desires, though, I feel like always goes pretty crazy, especially if you're going second. You get to draw that additional card, you can draw into like a board breaker. Now, the other question that I get is, when do you want to go first in a format and when do you want to go second? I think in most formats, especially right now, you just want to go second because the boards aren't really that impressive. I think the only time that I kind of pivot mid-tournament to going first is if I start playing against decks that I deem impossible to beat otherwise, right? So if I'm playing against like a super crazy combo deck that is absolutely going to put up too big of a board for me to kill, that I know is putting up anti-spell, I might just try to go first, because at that point, if I can set up like there can be only one and they're putting in cards to go first with, they're probably not putting in cards like Cosmic unless they don't have anything else good to side. So it just puts you at a better advantage point if you're able to put in cards that you know shut off your opponent, or if you can go first with like Trap Trick, D Barrier, because you're playing against like branded and you know that's going to win you the game. You really have to consider if your opponent's going to make you go first or go second, because there's a lot of different decks out there, even like Drytron, right, that are very comfortable going second. Usually they'll still just go first, but you kind of have to get a read on the situation and what's in your opponent's main deck, because let's say you saw like game 1 that they had a Lightning Storm, you're probably going to have to go first in game 3. So these are the decisions you kind of have to make on the fly, and you're not always correct with it. But sometimes when you're able to make that read and then you decide to go first and they make you start, it's so rewarding. So really try to pick up on that when you're playing, because I feel like that's something that you have to learn versus get taught, just because there's never really a rhyme or reason for your opponent to make you start. But there's a lot of times where, like, let's say you're on like a Mystic Mind deck, that's something where maybe they'll be like, you know what, you're going to go ahead and start. Because at that point, if you have like your Demise of the Lands or Metaverse and your Mystic Mind, it never really mattered, especially if your opponent opened up like an L-Storm. So that's something that you really have to consider. Now, kind of going through some of the history of Striker, talking about Ningirsu, the first one here. This card was to out cards that were really hard to get rid of, like Dragoon. This is something that I wasn't a huge fan of, especially because it doesn't point down, and I always found that really awkward, because usually you have to put up like a Hayate and then summon this underneath it. Otherwise, you can't really go for the same kind of plays that you want to. Like, you can always steal something and then go like Accesscode, but at the time that we had this card, we were summoning cards like Avermax, and you need another card that's special summoned from the extra deck, so you had to put up a Link Monster and then this, just to be able to make Avermax. And this is another card that also outed Avermax, so it was definitely an interesting format when this was around. Usually you'll see it pop in and out of Striker, but it's not super common anymore. Same with Diabolosis. This card was really popular back toward the YCS 200th, and this is something that was really cool, because if you go like Effect Array, you can use the effect of Diabolosis, bring it back, rip a card out of your opponent's hand. It was a 3000 body that was untargetable, so definitely another very problematic card that we saw. Not super common now, nor is it very good, but it was very funny. It was very funny. Now we have Trickstar. Now this was really popular for a little while, and having Light Stage to lock down a back row was definitely really devastating. But I wasn't really sold on this build ever. I think it'd be really cool to go like Light Stage at Lilybell and then have like Ray Rose or like a hand trap with a Lilybell, and then you could go into Camelo or Azalea just to be able to further extend your plays. Use Light Stage to lock down a back row. There's a lot that you probably could do with this nowadays. I don't really find the build to be very good, but it's definitely something really interesting. Orchist, unfortunately, we're still waiting on Harp Horror to come back. I think that Striker Orchist would probably be viable again as long as we do get back one Harp Horror, but we just haven't seen it yet, so maybe soon. We did see a bit of success with the Super Heavy Orchist deck, which was pretty cool too, so maybe we see people start messing around with this kind of a build, but as of right now, I don't think it's going to be really crazy. This was really popular back in Toss format. But we do have 2 engaged now, so there is a lot of viability that says, you know, it could happen again. The format was very different though, so we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. Striker Draco was definitely a build that was really crazy. 3 diagram, 3 engages at the time, being able to draw a ton of cards. You can draw off of your engages, you can get cards off of your heritage, off your disciples, you can go like heritage pop area 0 when you send it. There's just so many ways you could combo, and it was so good. So maybe this is going to be the most viable of the older decks coming up soon, I think. Just because we do have cards like Thrust now, so you could like Thrust into Terraforming and then get Diagram. So a lot of different ways so you can go ahead and play this deck. It's something that even when the deck was like super hurt, I brought it to locals and went undefeated one day, so I thought that was kind of cool too. The deck still has a lot of promise, but we'll have to wait and see if anyone does mess around with this variant too. Toon table of contents here represents Toon Cyber Dragon when we're going into Mega Fleet. This was when there was a lot of problematic cards in the EMZ, so this is something that you can consider. 3 Toon tables of contents is definitely really crazy because it gets you in a spell count immediately, and then being able to special summon out the Cyber Dragon, definitely another way to get a lot of free value. And again, Mega Fleet being there to just have the extra 2400 beat stick, also very cool too. So just something to think about, but maybe that comes up in the future. Artifact Ignition here, this was a card that was really utilized in Striker, but of course now we don't have Scythe. Thankfully, that card sucked to play against. But this was a very cool engine that was played in the deck. Usually it was like triple Sanctum, triple Ignition, 1 Morale attack, and like 2 Scythe. So definitely very cool. We probably won't see this again unless Scythe comes back. But I don't really see that card coming back anytime soon. So let's just hope that that's not a build that is viable, right? Metaflows Fusion, this is a card that I've even considered playing as of lately. I think there's a lot of ways to get this back into the graveyard. I've always thought this was really cool because even when we had linkage initially, I was like, oh my god, we could play like multiple copies of Fusion, but it would just be bad. But having the 1 Fusion in the deck, just so you can always put it in grave for spell count and then shuffle it back and get another draw, I've always thought this card was very good in the deck, and we'll probably end up seeing this in the deck again at some point, usually just for like going first, but at the same time you probably could going second, but it's just really uncommon. Very good card though overall. And then Typhoon probably won't really see a resurgence unless we see a lot of Secret Village at some point. It's good against Anti-Spell as well. I was talking about using it last format because if your opponent has Race Soul and they activate Birth, you could like Typhoon Birth, which is crazy. Or if your opponent goes like the Prodigy, activate the Monk, and then they activate the Peacemaker, you can then go ahead and use Typhoon to hit Peacemaker. So that was also a really crazy way to use Typhoon as a hand trap. But I could see this card probably coming back. Out of all these, I think it would have to be like Striker, Draco, Metaphoros Fusion, Typhoon being like the most viable. And then after that would be like Trickstar and like maybe the Toon Sidra thing. And the rest of them I don't really see coming back for a while. But we'll have to see what the next ban list does. So the next thing I want to talk about is going to be different variants of Striker and different things that you can do. So having the adventure cards in Striker, I see so many different comments from people being like, hey, you know, like how do we actually utilize the Brave package in Striker? And honestly, this is something that you really have to just test and try out as much as possible because it is really awkward sometimes. And this is something that got me my regional top, playing a 60 card Adventure Striker variant. One of the cool things that happened at the tournament, and I talked about this in my deck profile, was using my Adventure Engine in main phase 2. So if you normal summon Ray and they think that's all you have, it's actually really favorable because you go normal summon Ray, no one's going to interact with you normaling Ray because they know that's just a waste of cards. So then you go into Hayate, and you try to attack with Hayate, they'll interact with it, they'll clear it, you'll summon back Ray, you go main phase 2, and now they just hand trapped you and interacted with you, you go activate right since you never used Ray effect, right? And so then you can go ahead and summon out your token, get Fateful, go for Griffin, get a bounce now to get rid of something else that's a problem. So there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with this engine. Now we don't have Anaconda to go into DPE anymore, which is definitely unfortunate because that card was wild. But at the same time, there are other things that you can do with the engine, and I'll show that off in the deck profile here in a little bit. Now, the Runic engine is something that I never really loved in Striker. I thought that it was really bad. I did not care to play this. I did, however, make a build, and I'll show you this also later on, that I thought was really solid to play the Runic engine. Now, you really have to be very careful and test this out a lot before you play it, because the amount of technical play that you need to play a deck like this is intense, because you get into a lot of situations where your EMZ is blocked by like having a Striker link, or you have like Hugin but you don't have a linkage, so you have to pass on like Hugin, which isn't the best, so you have to live basically just off of Runic cards. There's a lot of different things that you have to think about when you're playing a deck like this. So again, when I show you the build, we'll talk about it, but also you have to realize that you have to do a lot of testing for this. As for Theory and Striker, I get a lot of requests about this deck, and if it's good, if it's bad, is it worth picking up Regulus? This is very bricky. I would not recommend doing this. This is something where if you open up Regulus, but you have no way to play through an Ace monster, then you basically auto lose, because now you have a brick in your hand that literally just, it doesn't do anything because you don't have an ace monster. And the number one problem with the deck has always been, do I see an ace monster? And that's always going to be the number one problem with the deck. Even if you add in a ton of ways to get to an ace monster, you either open up 5 ways to an ace monster or none. And this happens quite often. Even with 3 engaged, it can happen. So it's something that you really got to think about. And I never want to put myself in a situation where I'm like, listen, if I can't get to an EMZ monster and put that in the graveyard just so I can use Regulus, I'm not doing this, you know? So I heavily recommend to not do this, but always try out everything, because maybe it works out very well for you. But for me, I would say that I would not. So the next thing here is going to be Eldritch Striker. This also conflicts a lot, and I also wouldn't play this. The amount of, well, I just use Sanguine, no, I can't summon anything that's not a zombie, so I can't like summon back Ray or what have you. Having your traps in your main monster zone, like, you would have to play Droplet in a build like this. But it's something that I don't think would be very good in general. So this is something that I would definitely stray away from. And it also is a lot worse going second. Yeah, you have Golden Lord's effect that can go ahead and like send something to the graveyard, which is very cool. And it's like 3,500, so you can like use it to beat over things. But at the same time, I just don't know if that's really what the Striker engine is trying to accomplish. Because by itself, it already breaks the board very well. And going first, it can already set up a pretty minimal board, but do pretty well. But I don't know if I want to add a lot of trap cards and like clog my hand. So this is something that I probably just wouldn't recommend. But again, test everything, make sure it works the way that you think it does or doesn't, and then make sure that the results are accurate. And that's something that I always tell everyone, is because I've tried every Striker build under the sun. Like, I've been trying so many different engines, and this is something that you'll see later on, and just trying to figure out like what would make this deck really crazy. Like, we had Striker Draco, we had Striker Orcust, we had a lot of very good builds of Striker, right? But there's got to be something else. And so this is where I will tell you the decks that I think are going to be very good with it and the decks that I think aren't very good with it. Talking about my first build here, this is something that I put together because I was looking at the fact that there's probably a lot of branded this format since it didn't really get hit that hard. Having the Bishops in the main deck I think is really nice. You're probably like, well, why are they in the main deck? Because you can't really clear them that well. But you do have the extra multi-roll, so you can definitely go ahead and clear them if you need to. If you summon out a Rose, that's why I'm playing 2 in this build, you can summon Chaos Angel, put it in the EMZ, and that's going to be really hard out for a lot of decks. So that's really cool too. That's something that you can kind of do on the fly versus your matchups, because if you're playing on Striker, you're definitely not summoning Chaos Angel because it loses to spells and traps. But if you're playing against a deck like Kashtira, you just got to put up Chaos Angel and set a Widowmaker or an Imperm for Scareclaw Cash, and then you'll win the game. So it's pretty solid. That's something just to think about. But this is definitely going to be a very solid build going into the format. You'll see I have Lina with the Slain, the Dark. Again, I really like playing a lot of the different Charmers. If I were to change this right now, I'd probably change out Kaina for Hida. I just think that Hida is really solid too right now. The second burner does come up, but I just put it down to 1 in this build. I am on 3 Thrust and 2 Tactics. A lot of people have been asking me, you know, like, is Thrust mandatory? I think in a deck like this, it's pretty mandatory, just because if you know that you're going second and then you have the opportunity to add a card like Engage, there's not a time where you're not. And there's also a lot of different cards you can add, including just Talent. I think Talent in this deck is way better than Thrust, in my opinion. The other thing that I think is really important, though, is Book of Eclipse. Now, a lot of people were like, well, why aren't you on Book of Moon? I think Book of Eclipse is a lot better. Like, yes, you can get Ash, but there's a lot of other cards in this deck that they're going to Ash before Book of Eclipse. Unless they, like, really need to, and at that point, like, your other cards are just going to go through and it's fine. But, like, if your opponent is on Cash and they have Birth, Birth only banishes spells if you have face-up Kashtira monsters. So what you can do is just Book of Eclipse their board and then deal with the Birth afterward if you can link up into like a Accesscode or what have you, which is really important. But the other thing though is that I like Eclipse more because we already know that in Striker you have a really hard time dealing with set monsters. It's just always been the issue with the deck. But if you are in a position where, like, let's say you crack your opponent's whole board, right? And then you set Book of Eclipse and you pass. They commit something to their board, and then you Eclipse them and they pass back. Eclipse makes them flip in the end phase. Like, yeah, they get a draw, which is like unfortunate, but like now you can interact with that monster, because that means that you can steal it with anchor and have more damage. You can burner it and pop something else that's a problem. There's a lot of different things that now you can do with that monster because it's back face up and you don't have to worry about it just being set. And that's probably my favorite thing about running Eclipse in this deck. I think that it's very good. But moving forward, though, we do have the adventure build with like DPE. The first thing you'll probably see here is I have 2 linkage in this build. There's just way too many things to play, and so you had to make cuts somewhere. And I think that's like fine though. But you have the 1 Enchantress and the 3 right. I just wanted to have spell count over an Enchantress effect. I think that's fine. Having Valor in the deck, of course, I have Celine. Main decking their Chameleon 1. Another question that I get a lot is, how does Striker utilize their Chameleon 1 when you're locked under it too? Now, that's like kind of true, but at the same time, even if you're locked under your own their Chameleon 1, usually the decks that you're flipping it against can't play the game under it. So like, even if you still have a Shizuku, you could always do my favorite thing where you get a burner with Shizuku when you pass, and then you go activate their Combi so they can't play the game when they summon a monster. They like set a card, and then when it goes back to your turn, you can go like burner, pop your Shizuku, pop their back row, and then you can go like linkage, send something, and summon Kagari, add like engage, or you go like multi-roll, send Shizuku, burner, pop their monster with the set, normal summon array into Kagari in the battle phase so you can dodge Valor. There's a lot of different things that you can do, which I think is definitely very cool. I think that's another reason why linkage is so good, is because you can actually just dodge Valor if you know that it's in their deck in the battle phase, where you can get a lot of damage, where you can go like Hayate hit, and then you can go into Kagari, add back engage if you know that you can't like linkage OTK your opponent, and then you can go ahead and attack for more damage, engage effect, get something else, end phase Shizuku effect, which they'll probably Valor anyways, and then you just tactics them. I love tactics so much. That card's crazy. I could not fit it in this build, so it's in the sideboard, but there's just so much going on in a build like this. Do I think that DPE is very viable right now? Honestly, after a lot of testing, not really, just because I feel like it's too high of commitment, and then if you don't see it right away, it's not the greatest, and then if you do see it right away and they have like a Bishul, then it's kind of an oof. But at the same time, someone brought up to me the fact that you can actually just summon back Dasher, normal summon Rose, and summon Chaos Angel. So I think that's even more funny. But at the same time, I think this is definitely an interesting build and another one to check out, just because there is a lot of viability in putting up just a pretty solid board. I also cut the Souls package in favor of Prosperity because I was just trying to see Fusion Destiny over seeing something like Souls, because at the same time, like, draws are nice, but if you're going to play a package, I wanted to make sure that I saw it, because especially if I open up like Fusion Destiny Prosperity, then I'm digging for there can be only one. So I want to make sure that I can get like every piece of the puzzle. This is very reminiscent of the builds that we used to see at the beginning of when we got DPE. It was basically like the adventure package with DPE and there can be only one, and that was basically just the list that we're winning. So it's something that is still pretty viable. There can be only one is still a very good card. But overall, it's something that you're going to have to test out a lot, because the adventure package can be kind of awkward, but it's still pretty good. So here's another build that I was playing around with because I really wanted to try out Droplet. I realized that caches is still too prevalent in the format. Unfortunately, Droplet's just not going to be the best card. I still recommend potentially siding them, just because if you're not playing against cache, this card's broken. But this is something that you could even think about playing cards like Dark Ruler. Just know that you can't use Anchor the second that you Dark Ruler your opponent's board, so that's unfortunate, and that comes up quite a bit. But even in a build like this, I think it's really cool to have cards like Book of Eclipse, you know, just go ahead and bait the board break, and if they negate it, then you can go ahead and activate cards like Tactics. I am siding Thrust, and it's actually really funny. Like, when Thrust first came out, I was even telling people that I wasn't a huge fan of the card, and it really fell out of favor very fast. I think that it's only good specifically in decks like Branded, where you can set cards like Fusion Duplication, or if you're playing like Math Mech and you can set Super Factorial. I think Thrust is really insane. At the same time, I didn't want so many hard go second cards in the deck, and I really do prefer Talent. I think the card's just even crazier. And I know that like Thrust searches Talent, but I think Talent does more alone. Especially if you're playing against a lot of like the back row decks or what have you. I think this card's just a lot crazier. But there's a lot of builds you'll see from me that I'll be like siding Thrust. There's some that I'll main it. It really just depends on like what the format is and what I think I'm going to be playing against the most. Especially if you're on a build that plays like D-Barrier, of course you're probably going to be on Thrust, because it just gives you a card that's like really meaningful to set, right? Versus just like an Imperm. Never really a huge fan of that. Talking more so about the Runic build, I was sitting there thinking about this for a while, like what's going to be the most optimal build that we can do with Striker. Now, after looking at this again, I might put in a copy of multi-role, but I haven't really decided just because there is a lot of awkward situations where you can't clear your Striker link, so it's definitely preventing you from searching like another fountain. But having the Bishops here is really nice. You can go for the level 4 fusion from the extra deck, and then you can summon that to your EMZ, summon like a Druid's Worm, make Chaos Angel, and then send one and banish one, which is a way that I've been clearing a lot of boards, which is pretty funny. The other thing too is main decking Bishops against, like, Tier Limit has gained a lot of popularity at Kentucky. It got 2 out of 4 spots in the top 4. And then you also have MathMech, you have Branded, like so many different decks that just outright lose to Bishops, and then decks that really do struggle against Bishops. So I think this is something where maining them is actually really nice. You also have the opportunity to go for like the Dark Charmer and do like cool Reborn plays, go for lethal. Having the main deck Book of Moon is always really solid too, because if you're going first, then you have Hugin, so you already know whatever you set's going to be protected, so you can like set Book of Moon, and then that card is just inherently one of the craziest cards that we have in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Just been so good historically. And then having ways you can go ahead and like pop cards in the main deck with like Flash and Fire or Destruction. You have negation through Anchor and the Freezing Curses. Like the deck itself just works so well. And then when you're able to engage, you usually get to linkage first. You get rid of Hugin, go into Kagari add back engage again. And I'm on a small count of strikers in the extra deck too. I have 2 Kagari, 2 Shiz, 1 Zeke, 1 Hayate. I wanted more things that I could go into. You don't really need the Moonin in the extra deck as the other fusion. I think that it can come up and it's pretty nice, especially games 2 and 3 when you're afraid of getting cosmicked. So it's something that you can just go for. But the deck still needs a bit of work. I think the sideboard probably needs more work, if anything. But I do like this a lot. You could trade out Bishops and just main deck like triple Lava Golem and maybe like 2 Ash Blossom even, or like other spell cards that are like power spells. So that's something that you can definitely test out. But this is probably one of the highest ceiling decks that I've played. I think it's very good. There's a lot that you have to know in playing it. But at the same time, the more that you do play, I think that you'll get a lot better. It's a build that I'm not super sold on yet, but it's definitely the closest that I've come to enjoying a Runic variant of the deck. So definitely go ahead and try this out. Let me know what you think, because the build itself is really cool. The next one, this is actually something that I used back in Tier Limit format, and this is where I really want to talk to you about adjusting to a format. So one thing that you really have to think about is, what are the most problematic decks in the format? So when Tier Limit was like be all end all, right? Like that was the craziest deck that you could play against. I main decked 9 Bishops and 3 Bell, and this allowed me to play Allure. Now, you could have played Meister, so you had another dark target for Allure. I just felt like Bell was a lot better in most scenarios, so I had Bell in. But at the same time, I think that having the 9 Bishops was really crazy because, again, it's just a lot of damage that you can use. Having cards like Avermax in the extra deck, again, you have the Lina and the Dark Charmer, even IP, because I want to make sure that my Avermax was protected. And then you have your tactics. There's so many different ways you can build into a format, but this is a prime example of having cards, even like Soul Drain and Soul Release, to make sure that you could clear a grave. I have the Keldos and Mudora in my side deck because you side those in, so when your opponent makes you mill a ton of cards, they get really punished when you mill one of those. And I've always thought that that was one of the best things that you could do, because those cards are really annoying to play against. And before you could play the game, you needed to make sure that you cleared out your opponent's graveyard, because if they Keldo shuffle back all of your spells, you just lost the game right then and there. So there's a lot of different ways that you have to think about a format and adjust to a format. And this is exactly what I mean when I say build for the tournament or event that you're going to. Because if you expect a heavy amount of cash, then you're going to want to set up your list to play against a lot of cash. Now, the next one here, shout outs to Corm from my Discord. This was a really cool idea. He explained a lot of the different lines of play with Mikanko and Striker and different ways that it works. So the basic play that you're going to do here is use the Ritual to go ahead and grab the Arabesque. You're going to target your opponent's monster with the Arabesque, and then it's going to bounce their monster, summon out one from your deck, and then equip the Arabesque to your monster. So since this card would be equipped with an equip spell, then you're going to go ahead and add the Rondo, and then you can use Rondo to target your opponent's monster, and if it resolves, you take control of your opponent's monster. And then now you can use your Mikanko monster and their monster to summon Donner to trade with another card. Or you can just go ahead and start linking up into things like Hida. So I think that's really cool just because you have a lot of different options to clear a board. That's why in this build alone, I'm main decking the Dark Ruler. If you can Dark Ruler your opponent's board, you can crack the whole board. And so that's really cool. Now, of course, if you can like bait out all the negations or whatever they have on their board, then you can go ahead and do the same thing. But I think this was a really cool way to make sure that you can go and just clear a board and set up your own with very little resources. I'm also main decking the 3 Preparation of Rites just to make sure that you can see the ritual. I think overall the build's very interesting. This is going second, so keep that in mind. But there's a lot of different ways that you can go first in this deck too, and that's going to be playing 2 Ceremony, which allows you to special summon the ritual from your hand. So basically you're going to go Preparation into the ritual, and the ritual will go ahead and add you the Ceremony, and then you got to pitch a different card out of your hand. And then you'll use Ceremony to summon out the ritual, and then you'll banish the Ceremony from your graveyard and dump Rondo, which is really good because the ritual can quick effect attach it to your opponent's monster, so it becomes another interaction on your opponent's turn. And then playing 3 prep means that you can also play the Illusion of Chaos package and the Adventure package, because now you can go like Griffin, Token, the Ritual, Shizuku, and then you can use cards like Illusion into Souls to go ahead and get rid of a lot of your spells that you're not using and help you gain more advantage. You can also summon cards like Space Insulator to go into Heat Soul so you can keep drawing cards. So there's a lot of different ways that you can utilize the Mikanko package in Striker. Mikanko has picked up a lot of steam lately. I'm pretty sure it just got 4th place at the Philadelphia Regional. So definitely very cool and something that you can try out in the future. I play the 2nd Ceremony just to make sure that you can summon back out the ritual on the next turn, because it does go back to your hand eventually, but it is really nice to make sure that you do have a follow-up play that you can just search that again, resummon it, and then reattach the Rondo when you want to. So definitely a very cool build overall. Talking about the next one here, this is actually my most up-to-date list at the moment. So I was talking about playing like the One of Rhoda, Upstart, and Terraforming just so you always have a way to get more spells engraved. Main decking 2 Book of Eclipse just so you have another way that if you crack a board, you can set it and then pass over to your opponent. You have 2 Crow in the main deck. Crow is like randomly good against Pearly. It's very good against Branded. It's pretty decent against VS because if you're playing against Vanquish and they go like Rosin into their Link 1 and they go Link 1 to add back Rosin, you can Crow Rosin, and then all of a sudden it puts your opponent on like a really weird position where they can't just keep netting advantage every turn. So that's really nice. Having the Chalices in the main deck, again, just for the easy trades. Main decking the Triple Thrust, the 1 Talent, I think that's fine. Have the Hida and the Dark Charmer. Overall, I think this is just probably the most optimal build at the moment for going second. Going first, I really wanted to make it work, but it just hasn't really done that well, so I'm not super sold on it. I'd probably still be going second, but overall, I think this is the build that I would play if I went to a tournament tomorrow. So let's talk about some matchups. Now, I gotta be as unbiased and objective here as possible. This is something where Striker definitely struggles at the moment with certain matchups. It has a lot of very good matchups, don't get me wrong, but there is a reason why I still put it at tier 2, just because there is a lot of situations that you can run into that can be not favorable. Now, Kashtira is by and large your worst matchup, just specifically because of Birth. So whenever you're playing against Kashtira, you have to make sure that you either have the Book of Eclipse to book out their whole board so you don't have to worry about Birth, or you have the L-Storm to start your turn off so you can deal with Birth. So that's something that you really have to think about. Branded is a really crazy grind game. Being able to put a monster on your board every turn, it's really difficult when you can't target Sanctifier, so you have to open up cards like Bell or Droplet or Crow. Like, you need something to make sure that you don't get hit with a monster on your board. Of course, you can always like normal summon out of it, but at the same time, if the monster they're putting on your board is Gimmick Puppet, there's still not a whole lot that you're actually able to do. So keep that in mind, where this is actually just a really bad matchup. And then Labyrinth, of course, having Erad is never going to be very favorable for you, so another problematic situation. Now, talking about matchups that are randomly hard, Plunder Patrol can be very hard because of Yord and putting a token on your board, but at the same time, I feel like their grind game is wild. So this is something that you definitely have to make sure that you're on top of, and you're not really getting caught up into their grind game, and you're really setting your own tempo. And that's something that we talked about at the beginning of the video, is really making sure that if you were in a situation where you need to change the tides of the game, that you're really trying to make sure that you're keeping the tempo at where you want it to be and not letting your opponent just explode in resource advantage. Dragon, I wouldn't necessarily say that this is like really hard. It's just something where there is a lot of Bishals, and we'll talk about my opinion on Bishals versus Striker later, but it just makes it to be very randomly awkward sometimes, because the amount of damage that they can put up on the board and then being able to keep clearing Ray can definitely be problematic. It's not necessarily like a very hard matchup, but at the same time, it can be fairly awkward. So take that as you will. Dragon is definitely one that you want to look out for. Again, Bells are probably coming in against this matchup. There Can Be is coming in against this matchup. If I crack the board, I'm trying to activate There Can Be only one. You really have to try to make sure that you can deal with cards like Beast, which of course isn't really that hard to deal with after like one Lightning Storm, but it's still something that you have to be mindful of. Live Twin Runic Sprite, this is a deck that definitely has a lot of advantage. There's too many cards to interact with the hand trap, so this is where I'm probably just not worried too hard about hand traps, except maybe like Ash Blossom. I'll like keep that in, but the rest of it is going to be like a lot of power spells that I'm worried about. Even like Evenly Matched, I think Evenly Matched against this deck specifically is very good. Don't love Evenly because I don't like trading my battle phase out when Hayate is such an important factor of the deck. But against a deck like this, you really need to make sure that you have cards like Evenly Matched. If this becomes extremely popular, then you'll start seeing me probably play Evenly Matched, especially with Thrust, because you can just play one and get to it. But at that point, I'd probably just play 3 just to see it. Sun Avalon, this is a deck that, again, can be kind of rough. It's not super bad. This is a deck that gets dealt with Evenly. Again, another really good situation for Evenly. That or Lightning Storm, either or, they do pretty well. I think the hardest deck besides Plunder Patrol in this category is actually just Marinsas, and a lot of people might be confused as to why that is, but having cards like Gamir and having cards like Argonaut, so like you're already getting a spell and trap negate. Gamir can just banish things. Then you have the Wave, which makes their monsters unaffected. Trying to deal with the board like that can be really awkward, especially when their resource game is arguably better than yours, because of the fact that everything in your graveyard comes back to your hand for the most part, because even Pascal is adding back a card. You have an enemy, which can also add back a card. There's just so many different situations where this deck can outgrind, and that's something where you really have to make sure that you are setting that tempo. Again, cards like There Can Be Only One, really important in this matchup, and you really want to make sure this is one that you start off, because if you make them go second, there's not a whole lot that they're actually able to do. Like, they won't kill you going second. And that's something where if you open up like a There Can Be Only One, you're going to be in a really good position. And even not just There Can Be Only One, this is another situation where Book of Eclipse goes crazy. So that's something where this is a deck that I would absolutely be trying to start off against. The mirror match, I put this in fair because, like, if you're really good with the deck and potentially some of the people you play against aren't very good with the deck, then it's heavily in your favor. But if you start playing against people who have played the deck as long as you have, it can be pretty skill intensive. It's probably one of the most skill intensive mirrors. So this is something where it's fair until you start running into people who've played the deck as long as you have, because at that point it's going to be a very long and grindy game where you're trying to get more card advantage than your opponent. It's a lot of back and forth. So this is something that I put in fair because it really depends. This deck is all about the pilot. Like, there's very few decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! That I would say are strictly pilot based, and this is definitely one of them. Math Mech, this matchup's pretty easy. You just want to make sure that, you know, you don't die when they go second. So this is something just to keep in mind. Book of Eclipse, very good in this matchup. Having cards like Nibiru, of course, very good. I put this in fair just because there's a lot of times where they can outright just kill you, but at the same time, it's a very favorable matchup, so I wouldn't be too concerned about this one. Sword Soul, I'd be a bit more concerned. Same with Tearlament, just because Tearlament can still mill the shufflebacks, and they still have a lot of ways to combo, which can be a lot. That's why I like having a lot of Bishals in my sideboard, or even just maining them, because although the deck doesn't do like a ton, it still does a lot. Like I said, it got 2 out of 4 spots at the last regional in Kentucky, so deck's still doing quite a bit, and then having the shufflebacks around can be very scary for Striker. Sword Soul has a way that they can just outright kill you, so it's definitely really unfortunate when they go like, you know, bounce your Link, you like summon Ray. They don't really care at that point. They can go like Long Young into like a token, some Baron. So it really depends like what defensive cards you have. And this is another matchup where I might just say, you know, like you can go second, but at the same time, I'm probably putting in their Chameleon one. So when I break the board, I can then activate their Chameleon one. And I know for a fact that they can't come back from that. Purely, again, one of those matchups where like Zeus kind of sucks, but it's also like fine. Just if you're playing against Pearly, don't commit to the board too hard. This is where I really like Droplet, because if they go Delicious, target your monster because they want to like happy OTK you, I'm probably just waiting for battle phase and then going Droplet, send my own monster, negate their monster, and then they don't do anything. They put up Zeus, and then at that point you're like, who cares, you know, like Burner or whatever you have afterward, and play the game again. So it's like, it's a fair matchup, I would say. If they make like Nor, it can be kind of awkward. But for the most part, I think that it's pretty favorable. Gold Pride Punk, this is another one where you can like awkwardly lose because they go Nitro Head, summon a token, and that's where it can get kind of unfortunate. But this is where we're also talking about like multi-role being at multiple now, being able to out problematic situations like that. Just know that like the token outs anything around it, so you have to like put multi-role into like a pendulum zone just so you can make sure that they can't like Nitro Head get rid of it, right? So then you go like multi-role, get rid of the token. Now they can't respond to any of your spells, so it becomes a lot more favorable. But even then, your opponent can like Synchro Infusion on your turn, so you really gotta make sure that you're playing it very smart. Being able to activate the multi-role is pretty clean though, because if it does force out one of the interactions, then you have tactics, and that's even better, so it makes the matchup more favorable. You just got to think about a lot of different ways that they can interact with you before you start trying to like play the game. Because even if you Dark Ruler the board and they have like the trap card that pops one and summons one from deck, then they can keep interacting. So that's where Dark Ruler is like less good. This is another situation where I would say evenly matched is just insane. So evenly probably should be in your side this format. Again, I don't really like it. You could main it, but at the same time, I'm not like super sold on it, but it is pretty good. Even against the Melfi variant, evenly just cleans up. Like that card's crazy. So yeah, probably evenly, honestly. I think it sounds really good, at least in this format. But it definitely goes in and out, and you really want to make sure that you know when it's in and out of the format, because there's some situations where it's just bad. But right now, there's a lot of situations where it does just clean up a whole board. All you really need to do against Melfi Sprite is just go ahead and bait the carrot if they have it on board, and then just activate evenly match, and all of a sudden you win the game. You could even just like Anchor or Chalice target it and then just go battle phase and you win. Vanquish Soul, it's okay as a matchup. Like, I don't think this deck is super crazy. I don't think it's very good. And you probably net advantage way faster than they do. I'm going to tell you one of the funniest ways that you can go ahead and just absolutely delete this matchup. And that's something that I also learned from Korm. So shout outs to Korm. Naturally, you play around Mech Knights, so you don't put things in the same column. Against this matchup, if they have a Link 1 on board and they have a Rosin in hand, you just summon your monster in the same column as their Link 1. And I think that's hilarious, because if they summon the Rosin, they're not going to blow up their Link 1. I think that's even better because it's the vice versa. If they have a set card, you can set your card in their column. It's like, are you going to blow up your own card? I think that's really funny. There's a lot of ways that you can play against VS and win the game very easily. Ash and Tactics definitely just win this matchup as well, because they can't tag out their Link 1 because it's not a Vanquish Soul. So if they have a monster on their board and you know they have like Borgor or something, then you just like Tactics take their monster, and then they can't tag out at all, and they just lose the game. So a lot of very cool interactions. I think it's like fair because they can like tag out away from Widow Anchor, but at the same time, like it's very favorable for you to play against that matchup. Now, as for the rest of these, I have a category here called Can Be an Issue. That's gonna be like Dark World. Obviously, if your opponent starts popping off really hard and they start ripping out your whole hand, can be a pretty big issue. But if you do find yourself worried about any of these matchups and can be an issue, this is where main decking Nibiru is going to be your best option. I think that's always gonna be really solid against a lot of these. I don't really think that any of these are particularly very good, but at the same time, we are seeing Super Heavy being engine in a lot of decks. So I'm talking more so off of like the pure variant, but I think that Nibiru answers a lot of these very well. You could also side deck Droll. I don't like siding Droll in decks that can't just kill you. Striker can just kill, but through a lot of interruption and whatnot, usually not. So it really depends, but I do like the matchup against everything else on this list here. If I'm playing against Dark World, I'm going first every single time. If I'm playing against the Monodome deck, think that's fine. It's just another combo deck, so I'm not really worried about going second against it. I'm just gonna go ahead and side deck Dark Ruler. And then also against like Super Heavy, I don't really find the deck very real anymore. Same with Trap Tricks. I've never really liked this deck. I've also never lost to this deck playing Striker. So it's something that I'm not particularly worried about. Evenly matched is coming in 100% of the time versus this matchup. Flunder, Dino, Tri-Brigade, Drytron, Runic Naturia really isn't a deck as much anymore, just because the one Sacred Tree actually just hurt really bad. And then like Eldritch, I'm not really concerned against any of these. These are all pretty favorable. If you have an Ash Blossom in your hands, your only interaction, you just wait till Mist goes to the graveyard, they banish it, you Ash it, you win the game. It's like the craziest choke point for no reason. A lot of these just aren't very good, but I would just mainly be focused on the first two categories here, and just have a lot of knowledge of the fair category, just because there is a lot that you want to make sure that you know. And another big thing too about playing Striker is knowing what your opponent can follow up with. So for example, like if I'm playing against MathMech, right, I have a good idea if they have 8 cards left in their extra deck, and I can see obviously like what they've summoned and what's in their graveyard, and I have to make like a guess at like what's left. If I only see one Accesscode, I'm like, all right, there's an Accesscode left. If I haven't like Nibiru'd them, then I'm like, there's probably a Link Spider G Golem in there. So that's 3 cards. And it's kind of like the knowledge that you have of what decks usually look like is really important, because if you set an anchor and you know that's enough, because the only line they have to go for right now is like transcode into Accesscode, and you know that you're just going to steal the transcode the second they summon it, then you're probably fine. If you can remember everything that's added throughout their whole turn, it gives you a really good glimpse at like what the deck is gonna do on the follow-up. And that's something that I feel like a lot of people lack when they're playing Striker, is they don't have enough knowledge of the format. And I think that's only going to cause more issues for you at that point, because you might overthink what your opponent could do on follow-up, but realistically, they only have like one line of play that they can go for. So if you're going to be on Striker, make sure that you do play all the other decks online, or at least play against all the other decks enough to where you know what the general strategy is. You know what follow-up looks like. Because unless their follow-up is like crazy and they have 10 cards in their extra deck and you know they have multiple ways to kill you, then it's like, all right, maybe I need like an Anchor and a Shark Cannon. But if you're like, I don't really see them killing me through like Nib Anchor, then you're probably fine, you know? So I think that's something to really think about moving forward. Whether you're building Striker for a local, a regional, a YCS, or a national event, you really have to make sure that you understand the format. Especially if you're going second with the deck, you have to make sure that your board breakers are accurate. So today we're going to be building this deck as if I were to bring it to nationals, and just considering everything that we've seen so far in the format, you have to know this game is by a week-to-week basis. This whole format could change in a week. We see a deck like Base come out, and all of a sudden that's the best deck in the game. So you never really know, and especially looking ahead toward nationals, it's still a little bit away. So that's going to be really crazy in the next couple weeks to see what people come up with. We've already seen quite a few very interesting deck lists. So this is something that you really have to keep up with when you're playing a deck like Striker, because again, those blowout options have to be accurate. So to start things off here, we have 3 Ray and 1 Rose. I'm probably never bumping up the Rose count. I just don't want to play more than 1. It's just really bad to summon, especially into a format where there's a lot of Book of Moons. The second that gets set into your main monster zone, it's not good. So I really just want to make sure that I'm seeing Ray or Linkage and not Rose. Rose is specifically there just so you can have the option to go for like the Linkage OTK, and then you also have the ability to go ahead and Reborn Rose to get the extra negation, or just another body if you want to go for like a Zeke play. So I like that just being in the deck at 1. Talking about the rest of the Striker engine though, we have 3 Anchor, 3 Linkage, 2 Engage, 2 Burner, 1 Drone, 1 Shark Cannon, 1 Area Zero, and 1 Multi-Roll. This is all very standard. 2 Burner going second is what you want to play. It's very good into most decks. It's not very good in like Branded, but everything else is really solid. Of course, being able to blow up a back row as well is going to be one of the best options for this card. We have 2 Engage now, so this is definitely a little bit better for your Area Zero to hit more. Usually you won't really see me running Area Zero, but now that we have more Engage, it just gives you more of an incentive to play it. Next up, we have our one-ofs. I'm still playing Rhoda, Terraforming, and Upstart Goblin. Again, I don't really care that I'm giving my opponent 1,000 life points, especially because I'm already getting spell advantage. That means that my engages are going to be able to draw a card soon as well. So I would way rather just play the one-off spells just because they're super free in the graveyard. Next up, we have 3 Thrust and 1 Tactics. This is fine. I really like playing more than one talent, but at the same time, it's fine to play 3 in 1. I think that only if you're playing against a lot more combo that thrust is actually very good. But I think that talent is just overall a lot better. So if you can't afford thrust, I know I get that question a lot, you could just play 3 talent instead and then play like another spell. But I still like talent a lot in this deck. It's really crazy. If you're playing its combo, then of course thrust is just wild because you get talent or engage. Usually just engage because then you get more draws as well. But overall, the card is very good. And this is probably the number that I would run it at, potentially putting in another tactics later on down the road, but for now it's just 3 in 1. Then the hand trap lineup, this is very format dependent and very event dependent, because I would go with 3 Ash, 3 Imperm, 2 Veiler, 2 Nibiru, just because the Nibiru is still very relevant as you play against like Kashtira or Sword Soul, or a deck that just doesn't respect it. But also just having a lot more generic negation between Veiler, Ash, and Imperm I think is definitely correct. Looking at the rest here, we have 2 Desires. This is where I just want to make sure that there's a lot more consistency in the deck, especially going second. I want to be able to draw a 6th card. If I'm going first, then I really want to be able to draw into my There Can Be Only One. So you really have to decide on the fly if you're going to be going first or second against specific matchups, but that's always going to depend on what you're more worried about. Especially if you know that they're probably on anti-spell, then you'll probably want to go first. The last 3 here being 2 Book of Eclipse and 1 Evenly. Now, we were talking about this earlier. Evenly is pretty good in this format. I like it a lot. I usually don't like Evenly in Striker at all, but as of now, I think that it's a pretty solid option. The 2 Book of Eclipse is something that I still like a lot because, again, into Kashtira, it's really relevant. Into Labyrinth is another card that can really help you deal with Lady because you can't target it otherwise. So when they go ahead and use a trap card, you can chain the Book of Eclipse so they can't set a new one with Lady and then put Lady face down. Otherwise, you force out another trap card just so they can set one that they want. So it's definitely very good to go ahead and bait any kind of negation. You can force interaction. I think overall Eclipse is very solid. So to start talking about the extra deck, we have 3 Shizuku, 3 Kagari, 2 Hayate, 2 Zeke. I still think this card is insane. This card comes up all the time. I definitely wouldn't bump this down to 1 until we get like Camellia, because then I'll play like 1 Azalea, 1 Zeke, 1 Camellia. But as of now, Zeke is definitely just a 2 of. And then 1 Azalea, we are getting this in Monstrous Revenge before Nationals, which is very exciting. Again, generically using Lights and Darks to go into your engine is very good. So if you do want to side like Bishals, you can. You do have the option now to go like summon Nibiru on your opponent, the normal Veiler, which is cool. Or you can like Talents take a monster, use that monster and Nibiru to go into Azalea, which is another spot removal as well. So definitely a very solid card for the deck. Moving forward though, we have Accesscode, Unicorn, and then Hida and Dark. This is very standard in most of my lists. I always play a generic Link 3 just so you can have Accesscode hit 53, and then 2 Charmers at least. I really want to make sure that I have more ways to utilize my opponent's monsters out of their graveyard, and it's just another thing where if like your Dark Charmer dies, you can search Ray, or if you want to go for an Accesscode play, of course the Charmers just make that a lot easier. Talking about the sideboard though, 3 Bell and 3 Crow. I think Crow is very generically good. If you're playing against like Pearly, you can go ahead and banish the card that Lily targets. You can banish the Fusion Duplication target from Branded. There's a lot of different cards that you can go ahead and hit with Crow that are pretty impactful right now. Then also Bell, generically very good against Branded and many other decks. So just something else to consider. But I think both of these cards should just be a mainstay in the side because they just sub out with other cards in your main deck to make sure that your hand trap lineup is always accurate. Which again, if you're going second, you want to make sure that you can minimize the board as much as possible so that you can break it and set up your own. So talking about the rest of the sideboard here, we have Cosmic. This is very self-explanatory. Runic's around, Labyrinth is around. You just want a quick answer to anything in the back row. You just play Cosmic instead of Elstorm or Duster because those cards just lose to Summon Hugin. And whenever there's Runic in the format, typically we just shift to playing Cosmic instead. It's also pretty good against Labyrinth if you can banish like a big welcome off the board so you don't have to worry about the bounce as well. Even against the mirror match, you can go ahead and chain this to engage so you get rid of one of theirs for the rest of the game, which is very good. But the next thing here is the other 2 evenly matches. Again, I think this card's very good in the format. I'm only maining 1 because you can thrust to it too. But if you're in a situation where you know that card's going to be very impactful, then you really want to make sure that you have all 3, including thrust, because then thrust can just search engage. But the other 3 here are going to be There Can Be Only One and then a Herald of the Abyss. There Can Be Only One is if you know that you have to go first, especially if it's like Sword Soul and you know that anti-spell's coming down. So there's a lot of situations where you know that you want to start. But the Herald of the Abyss is just in case you play against against anything super random, like even Pearly, right, that puts up a huge Nor and you need to be able to out it, or if you play against like Adagnister, which is still something that's running around, that you have a way to clear the tower. There's a lot of reasons why you should at least run one of that if you're running the Thrust. You can even just use Herald the Abyss on a Rise Heart, which is insane. So very good card to run generically overall, just to make sure that you have another spot removal. But this is a list that I would run if I took this deck to Nationals. I think this is very solid. But again, you're never truly done deck building until the event comes. So if you do have any other questions, feel free to comment them down below and I'll try to answer them as much as possible in terms of updates right before the event in case you want to make any last changes. Historically, in Striker, there are a couple flex spots in the extra deck which are pretty cool. You can run like Zeus, so you can steal Gigantic, attack, make Zeus in the EMZ, Zeus wipe the board, and then you can use linkage to get rid of it, summon Kagari, add something back, and then go about your turn. You can use Albion if you summon back your opponent's Mirror Jade, then you can go Mirror Jade effect, which is crazy. It catches everyone off guard. It's really funny. In Toss format, we were reborning our opponent's Dingirsu using it against them, or you reborn your opponent's Galatea and then slap a Dingirsu on top of it so you can actually attack with it and then you also send with it. So that's pretty cool too. There's always going to be cards like this in a format that you can just play randomly to really catch people off guard. Again, this is very dependent on what the best deck is in the format. I was even running in a Rise Heart in my extra deck, so you can steal a Fenrir if your opponent uses Shangri-La effect in the standby phase, which is really funny because then once you steal it, you can make an a Rise Heart right over top of it and then go ahead and attack, make Zeus, and clear the board that way. So a lot of really cool flex spots that you can run. Phoenix, this is a card that you really should consider running. It's very strong, especially in anti-spell formats. This is something that you'll see quite often go in and out of the extra deck. Not right now, but the second we start seeing anti-spell again, you definitely want to run this. Forbidden Droplet, the best striker card ever printed. No, but for real though, this card is actually just insane, and it's really unfortunate that we can't play it right now because of D-Shifter and a Rise Heart. But Droplet, when we're allowed to play that in Striker, this card is absolutely mad. This is something where if you look at a card like Baron, it has 3,000 attack. Now what's very special about that is having 3,000 attack, once he gets dropleted, you can do a lot of very cool plays. So one thing that you can do is you can summon Ray and then go into Hayate, crash in a Baron, then you can dump like an Anchor or whatever you need for the moment, and then go Ray effect in the graveyard, attack with Ray, and then you can go into Kagari, playing around Valor in the battle phase to add back that Anchor or whatever you sent, and now you're in a very good position. If you just broke a whole board with a Baron, you can also hold Droplet for your opponent's turn, because what you can do is once you break the board, you go Shizuku, add Shark Cannon summon back Baron. Now you have an Omni negation on your board, and then you can set Droplet, which is really cool because once you negate something with Baron, if they continue further, you can go ahead and send Baron and then Droplet your opponent's monster. Now your Anchor and your Shark Cannon is live if you reset it with like a multi-roll, which is even better. But my favorite thing is that if you get to keep that Baron, now if they get rid of like your Striker Link, or let's say you didn't have one because you ended up like ending your board with nothing on it, but you did have a Shark Cannon, now you can use Baron, return it to your opponent's extra deck, and reborn Ray. So there's a lot of different situations that Droplet and even Shark Cannon can come up together. I like those cards a lot together because usually you can do some really crazy things. I've done that with like resummoning out like a Makaba or what have you. There's a lot of crazy cards that you can reborn from your opponent that they're just not expecting you to do. So again, Droplet, the best striker card ever printed, hands down. When you're allowed to play this card, you definitely play this card. Now, in some formats, more mid formats, this is a very cool option for the deck just because this is such a kill button. Going Ray Rose into Utopia double, grab double or nothing, and then go Utopia attack for 10,000. It's pretty crazy. So this is something to consider because this does pop in and out of formats, and it is a very cool option for the deck. Talking more so about other options, potentially ones that I wouldn't do right now, that'd be DPE. I think DPE just doesn't really have the payoff that it did because just being able to go into Anaconda was so nice, and this was such an easy way to get this card out of the deck. Having to hard draw Fusion Destiny is just not really super optimal, even if you have Thrust, especially with Bishals in the format. I remember when this card was like super problematic, and now we just have Bishals, and it's like, well, not really that crazy anymore, so probably wouldn't do this right now, but it's definitely a very cool card still. This is a great tech still. I love this card. White Howling. If you control a water monster, you can target one spell in your opponent's graveyard, banish it, and then if you do, for the rest of the turn, negate all spell effects on your opponent's field. This is crazy in the mirror match because you pass on Shizuku in this. You could also play this against Branded as well. This is an FDK in the mirror match. This is actually just wild. This card, the second that you flip it, make sure that you don't flip it in response to Area Zero, because if you didn't already know, you don't have to add a card off of Area Zero. I've played against people in the mirror match where I go Area Zero and reveal Engage, and then I don't even take Engage. I just let it go back in the deck so my opponent doesn't draw. So if you have this card in a Striker Mirror, you're probably just winning that game. It's pretty crazy. You get a draw off of the Kagari add back, you get a draw off of everything that they do. So this card alone definitely just wins the mirror match. This card used to be a very good tech for going first, and I still think that it is. It's not as good as it was in Prank Kid format when you're clearing the normal summon, but it's still a very good spot removal. You do skip your next draw phase, but a lot of times if you have a card like this in a matchup where it really does matter, I think this card can be very potent. Now, I've probably had 100 conversations about Hamp. Don't run this card. It's not good. It's not good at all. This card just does not solve any of the issues of the deck. The fact that you need an ace on board makes this card unplayable. The number one problem in Striker is not opening up an ace monster, and now you're like, all right, cool, if I open up Hamp, now it's real dead. I would rather just run a Kaiju at 3 at that point, because at least you can use it right away, and then the rest of your board breakers in your hand are just online. So this is something where I would definitely make sure that if you're looking toward board breakers, I really wouldn't run this card. It's not good at all. A lot of people were like, well, you can search it off of Engage. Do you really want to be using Engage for Hamp? Not really, especially if you didn't open up an ace monster, so usually this card is just never really coming up. I just heavily recommend that you don't run this card. So talking more so about the thought process while playing the deck, something that I really want to just talk about is not overcommitting to the board, and I think that's really important. What is your advice on knowing when to step on the gas or play slow and methodical? Also, what are some helpful tricks that maybe not every Striker player knows? So talking a bit more about overcommitment to a board, I think this is something that I see a lot of people fall for, where they're like, oh, I'll just set 5 so my opponent won't have the Duster, and then they have Duster and they're like, oh, I lose. But there's a lot of situations where, like, let's say you have 2 anchors, set 1 anchor and hold the other one. The same thing if you have like 2 there can be only ones, just set one of them. If you're about to lose to a blowout, especially evenly, when you know that you're not going to die, make sure that you're holding as much as you can. Now, there's times where this might make you lose just because you held too much, so you kind of have to make that judgment call on the fly. Even cards like Cosmic against Runic, let's say you're in games 2 or 3 and you want to set Cosmic, it could be correct to do so, but also you might want to consider just holding it a little longer till the next time that it comes back to you, because the second they use a Runic card, you can't lose, because at that point they can't have a battle phase, therefore you're not taking damage. And even if they put up like a Hugin and a set or 2 and they have a few cards in hand, when it comes back to you, you just Cosmic the Fountain right away. You're not playing into a Runic Destruction on your set and then your Cosmic's gone, or a Duster when they open up their turn, or like a Lightning Storm. You're just holding it an extra turn, so at that point you're getting the most value out of your resources, because you know when you pass to Runic, they're not able to kill you because they don't have a battle phase. So there's no point not to just hold the Cosmic. Like, yeah, they might get a couple draws, but when you go to just put up lethal, because you know Ray and Linkage is lethal, especially against a deck like Runic that doesn't really play that many hand traps, at that point all you really need to do is burn the Hugin and potentially deal with some back row, and you have lethal. So that's something where you really want to make sure that you're not overcommitting to your board, because like I was talking about earlier too, if you have 2 floodgates, there's not really a reason to set both. At that point, just set 1, especially if you have the extra anchor. Just hold those, because now you have like 4 or 5 cards in your hand, so when it comes back to you, you can put up a whole nother board, even if they have to waste like their 1 Lightning Storm or Duster on your 1 or 2 sets, just to make sure that they can play the game. Now you can go back into them with way more cards. So if you're going to lose to a blowout anyways, I think that it's more important to make sure that you're holding resources for the follow-up. This situation is the same as if you think that your opponent's going to make you go first or second. This is very learned and not taught, as far as just to understand when to commit to the board and when not to overcommit to the board. Because there's a lot of situations, especially game 2 and 3, where there's literally no reason to play into a huge blowout, especially if you just know that Evenly is very popular in the format. That's probably one of the better ones to have to play into, but just know that you have to use your spell cards at the beginning of the battle phase. If you chain them to Evenly, they'll still get banished face down, so make sure that you're chaining your anchors onto your own Shizuku, or you're just chaining whatever you can to make sure that by the time that it gets to the end of the battle phase, that Evenly isn't really going to hurt. Now, if you have like a There Chameleon set, I'm probably just banishing Shizuku face down at that point, because you should always have a way to play in your hand, whether you're adding Engage like you usually would. If you have an anchor in your hand, you should be adding Hornet Drone. You need to make sure that in your hand you have a way to play the game. As far as some helpful tricks that could come up in your gameplay, one of the things with Accesscode that you will want to know is that if you use your opponent's Druid's Worm or their Shurag, what have you, anything that has a graveyard effect, when you make Accesscode with it, your opponent can't use the graveyard effect because it can't respond to Accesscode. So that's pretty cool, and that comes up quite often. The other thing too is that if you have Ray on board, let's say this is a mirror match, use Ray effect when you go to summon Kagari, because your opponent can't Shark Cannon re-summon your Kagari because it wasn't summoned properly, it was summoned by Ray's effect. So that'll come up quite often, and that's really important in the mirror match. Now, when you use Hayate effect, stop sending Engage. Unless you know every card in your opponent's hand from them like adding over the turn or what have you, this is one of the riskiest things that you can do, and your Kagari will almost always get negated. Now, if you send something like Anchor or Burner, the likelihood of Kagari getting negated goes way down. It's like if you Pros for 3 versus Pros for 6, are you really going to Ash Pros for 3? You may find that very anecdotal, but I'm telling you, the more that you do it, the more that you find out that Kagari is way less likely to get negated if it's not engaged that you're targeting. So that's something that's really important to know, and that's something that you kind of just learn from playing the deck. But overall, stop sending Engage with Hayate. This is something where, again, unless you really need to like greed Engage and you need a search and draw or else you're going to lose, then it's fine. But I'd way rather go like dump Anchor or dump Burner to help you clear a board or to set up an interruption. You can always go Shizuku to add Engage as well. This also helps play a little bit better around Ash Blossom. So if you send Anchor and add Anchor, then at least you have a for sure negation. If you like dump Engage, add Engage, activate Engage, and they Ash you, then Shizuku's just adding Anchor and now you can't even set it. But if you just go ahead and send Widow, and then add Widow and set Widow, and then you go Shizuku, and you add Engage, then cool. Even if they have Ash on the following turn, that's whatever. But if they Ash Shizuku at that point, then you're like, alright, that's also kind of whatever, because at least you have an anchor. So definitely consider that in your gameplay, because that's just a very simple way to not lose to a hand trap. While we're talking about tips and tricks, here's one of my favorite. You can go normal summon Ray, go into battle phase, attack for 15, and then go end of battle, Ray effect, chain link 2, evenly. So that's pretty wild. This is something that comes up quite a bit, so definitely something to use in your gameplay. Another huge point that I want to go over here is don't main deck too many hard go second cards. Even a card like Duster after you break a board is really lackluster. It could be like a Cosmic that you could set into a field spell or a Fateful Adventure. You could have cards like Chalice, Droplet, Offerings to the Doomed, things that really do interact with your opponent. Now, I'm not saying don't main deck any hard go second cards. You should, but at the same point, don't main deck a ton so it just breaks out your hand past breaking a board, because you still need interaction with your opponent. How bad do Bishals hurt Striker? Now, this is a question that I get quite often, and it's kind of funny because I don't really feel like it's even that crazy, especially if you're playing against like Bishal control and you have their Chameleon one, and now their Magnemut's locked under that. And even if they get rid of like Shizuku, it's kind of whatever, because if you're playing the deck correctly, you should always end with a way to play in your hand, whether it be a Ray, a Rose, a Drone, or a Linkage. And the Bishals, of course, it's unfortunate when you get hit by them, but they're not like game breaking. They don't decide the match. Overall, do I think that Bishals hurt Striker that bad? No, I would say that they're more annoying than anything, and they're definitely not something that I'm just going to put the deck down over, right? I feel like the only reason that you'd really stop playing Striker is because of like the shuffle backs. When those were at 3 and 3, it just made the deck literally unplayable. It was awful. Now we are getting Azalea before Nationals, so I just want to go over this card real fast. If this card is special summoned, you can target one card in the field, destroy it. If you have 3 or less spells in your graveyard, send this card to the graveyard. Once per turn, start of the damage step. If this card battles an opponent's monster, you can banish one spell from your graveyard graveyard, destroy that opponent's monster. This makes me feel like we're getting a spell that adds back from the banish zone, or like a monster that does that, because that's the only interaction that we really don't have yet. So that's probably going to be what's on the way, I would imagine. This card's very cool because you can use lights and darks, so it even makes the Runic build a little bit better for the time being, because you can use Hugin or Gary alongside a hand trap to go into this, which is really nice. Overall, the card is very cool for the deck. I think that it's a lot better in decks that aren't Striker, because that allows you to generically go into this and then activate like an engage, and then go Kagari, add back that engage, and then therefore a Striker is now very splashable. I think that is even more splashable when we get Camella, because you can just go into Camella effect, dump engage, go into Kagari, add it back, activate engage. That card's gonna be wild, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But I do think that we'll see this card in a lot of other decks. We'll still see it in Striker as well, but I think that this card is going to be utilized in a lot of other decks just because, again, it's more so generic into light and dark decks, and then you get a free destruction out of it too. Talking about Camellia though, this card is good. This card is very, very good. So what this card does is, once per turn, if you have 3 or less spells in your graveyard, you can send a Striker card from your deck to the graveyard. So therefore, it's basically Hayate without the battle phase, which is very good. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can target one monster your opponent controls, special summon this card to their field, and if you do, send that monster to the graveyard. Also, shift control to this card's owner during the end phase of this turn. So this card also has the restriction that it not only must be first link summoned, you can only special summon Camella once per turn. Now, this might seem a little weird because the second effect you can't use the same turn that you summon it. But what if I told you that solves one of the core issues of the deck? So what's really cool is if you open up too many ace monsters, right? You have like a Ray, a Rose, and a Linkage. What you can do is you can go Ray, Rose into Camellia, dump something out of your deck, and then you can set Linkage and pass to your opponent. Because now what you can do is, the second that your opponent commits to the board, let's say it's a deck like Prank Kids, right, that really needs that normal summon, you can go Linkage, summon Kagari, add back the card that you sent. Now Camella can go off, get rid of your opponent's monster, summon Camella to their board. If they can't extend past that, you get back Camella in the end phase, and then you can keep popping off back into your turn. So this is a really clean way to get a really solid interaction when your hand is very bad. Another question that I get asked quite a lot is, are you playing a lot more hand traps or board breakers? And it really depends on the format. I think right now that we're in a format where you could play 6 to 8 hand traps and be fine. You could also play like 6 to 8 board breakers and be fine, and just the rest engine, or just generic spell cards to help you get spell count in graveyard. Because right now, the end boards aren't really super impressive, but hand traps do matter. Ash, Bell, Crow, Imperm, Veiler, all very good. If you're worried about things like Kashtira or Sword Soul, then Nibiru is also very solid, but you really have to figure out like what are the most prevalent matchups in a format, and that's really going to answer this question. I think at the end of the day, you should really ask yourself, what matchups are you more afraid of, and prepare more for that. But also understand that you might be preparing for rounds 1 to 4 instead of 5 to 9. And what I mean by that is, let's say that you're more worried about getting hit with like Vanity's Ruler in Drytron. That's more of something that you might see like rounds 1 to 4 of a regional or an event. But later in like 5 to 9, you're probably seeing more Branded and Kashtira. So if you're going to take the chance on playing a tech card just to deal with a very niche situation, understand that when you hit a later round in a tournament, you could find yourself struggling because you have cards that aren't ready to answer some of the biggest problems in the format, more so a niche scenario that could come up. What percentage of playing Striker is knowing what nearly every other deck wants to do versus knowing the Striker cards themselves? I would say probably like 80-20. You really need to know what the format is doing before you play this deck, just because it's very dependent on the format and what cards you're playing. But there are a couple interactions that I feel like you just generally have to know, like Linkage Chain Anchor. And this is a really cool interaction because let's say you want to get rid of a monster off of your opponent's board. You go Linkage Chain Link 1, Chain Link 2 Anchor, steal their monster, and when this effect resolves, you can send their monster to the graveyard for linkage and then summon out like Kagari. So this is a very cool line that you definitely have to know. Just bringing everything full circle as well, talking more so about technical play, it's also very important to know what cards break what boards. Because looking at a board like this, which is a standard Sword Soul end board, being Chi-Shao, Baron, and Blackout, all you need to do is go Burner, target Chi-Shao, and then when they Baron negate, you chain Anchor, target the Baron, and now the Chi-Shao is dead, the Baron is negated, and the Blackout has no worm to target. So it's pretty crazy, and they have to negate with Baron at that point because they'll lose 2 interruptions in favor of 1, because at that point, either they can keep the Baron and have an Omni negate, and let the Chi-Shao die, or they can just negate with Baron and keep the negation with Chi and have Blackout. So this is a very great example of using as few cards as possible to break an entire board. Now let's check out another situation. So this is a very specific scenario, but I've had this come up quite a few times on stream where people are like, wow, I didn't think to do it like that. So something that you can do to play around impermanent-esque effects to get the full value out of Engage, if you have like a spell in your graveyard, you can use Engage to grab Anchor, get sent with the linkage, and then you can use Kagari's effect now that you have 3 spells engraved to target your Engage, and if they use their Chi, you can use your Anchor to steal their Chi and then get Engage back, so now you can get a lot of damage and you have follow-up. So this is a really cool way that you can utilize having minimal spells engraved and just kind of trading out the third card for each other. So this is another question that I get quite a lot, and that's what's the win condition of Striker? And that's realistically going to be the very slow grind game that you're going to be, you know, poking with Hayate for 15, another 15, now they're at 5,000, now they're in a range where you can at least go Accesscode and kill. You're always going to snowball harder than your opponent in advantage, and that's something that just happens with Engage, and then a lot of the other power spells that you play like Tactics and Thrust. But overall, the win condition is going to be, you know, the slow grind with Hayate and Accesscode. But some games do end pretty quickly if you can go like Talentless, take a huge monster and have a lot of damage. You can save your Anchors and your Shark Cannon for one huge explosive play when you steal like 3 of their monsters and 1 out of their graveyard. Go for Accesscode amongst the other monsters that are already on your board. There's a lot of very cool ways that you can go for lethal with Striker. Well, everyone, that's the end of the Ultimate Striker Guide, and I really do hope that you enjoyed. This is roughly 3 hours and 40 minutes of footage, so I'm probably going to cut this way down just to get rid of any rambling or anything, just to make sure that it's only the information that you really want to know. So I do hope that you did enjoy this video. Again, if you haven't already subscribed, consider subscribing because we are on our way to 20,000 subscribers. If you haven't already checked out my Discord, Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, or Metafy page, definitely go ahead and do so, all down in the description below, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful night, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you.